and welcome to this edition of Energy Inc.'s Thrive Live. I'm Reverend Darryl Moch. I am the host for this. We have a very special guest with us today, who will not be on camera, whose voice and image will be adjusted if they were ever shown to protect the innocent, quote unquote. I like to say that. But we give people an opportunity to come on the podcast and share their stories without necessarily having to reveal publicly if they're not ready their face or their actual voice or their location. So we want to honor that. We want to appreciate people who are able to share real stories. These are real people sharing real stories with real solutions. And so we're excited about it. We have a very special guest today. He goes by the name Jack the Peepo. And so Jack will share his story, and we're so excited. Thank you, Jack, so much for agreeing to be on and to share your story, which is quite riveting and very, very detailed, and I think informative for our community that they'll hear and hopefully get some insight and solutions for themselves by hearing your story. So thank you again for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Department of Behavioral Health with funds from the state opioid response grants. And so we are very, very excited to be here with you to share in this episode of Energy Incorporated real people, real stories, and real solutions. Again, I'm Darryl Moch, and I'm happy to be your host today, here with our very special guest, Jack the Peepo. So, Jack, tell us a little bit about your story and how, tell us your story.
Well, I grew up with fairly normal, standard home, and it was around the age of 14 years old, and it was fairly recently after my stepfather passed away that I started to get into drugs and violence and crime in some respects where it was entirely an irresponsible, youthful, misguided attempt into managing with different issues. And I
Take your time. It's okay.
and now at the age of 22, I've been clean ever since. And now I do addiction meetings every week to try and help people in the community where I set it up out of my own pocket at the church. And I try and give back and try and lead people away from these sorts of crutches that put them into a dark path rather than supporting them for a healthy way to manage these issues.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the when you went into about the dark part when you went into your addiction and what were you using? How often were you using? What kinds of things did you do while you were using? Tell us some more about the story of that dark part.
Um, yeah, so as I said, it was about the age of 14 and I started to use cocaine. And, it really did start off as like, the thing where you're out with your friends and like, oh, do you want a can of beer or do you want to have something like that? And at that point, it was the cocaine, uh, and it was literally just a couple of lines every other week, that sort of thing. When I was with my mates, and it started to devolve when I was about 15, 16, where it got to the point where I began selling it. I started to get into fights with people, and I was at the lowest. I was using more than 3 grams in a day, every day, and that would just continue on and on. And the only times I wouldn't would be if I wasn't having Annie around me for a little while, when I'd go see family or whatever. But yeah, and I sort of did have moments in there where it was like, I know the damage it's doing. I could feel my breathing go wrong. I felt like my heart palpitations and the unsteadiness with my mind. Well, I should add, I'm a paranoid schizophrenic, right?
Mhm.
And as you could imagine, a stimulant as strong as that would lead some already unstable mental condition and go far, far worse. So I'd have detachments from reality, auditory hallucinations. I mean, I've even got a scar on my forehead because I was so out of it that I wasn't able to operate a door, and I kept banging my head against it until I drew blood and knocked myself out. And, you know, looking back on it now, as like I realised how much harm I'd done to others and how much I'd done to myself, and noticing the people around me, the harm they were doing to themselves, harm they were doing to me, and harming to even like the family around them. And it it was when I came to the realization and I stopped that I decided to take it upon myself to reach out to others and try and bring them away from it, because as this sort of phrase, misery loves company, right? you,
Yeah.
you don't you don't find an addict by themselves. They always know someone else, right? And it it became sort of like I was seeing these other people who in their own lives they had a miserable family, they had miserable friends, and they were miserable themselves, but their outlet for it would be something that would make it worse.
Mm. So, Jack, during the course of your time of using, can you give us a list of the various things that you used over time?
Well, as I said, the main thing was cocaine. Sometimes I would wash it up into crack to smoke it. Uh, I smoked weed, but I was never really a fan of it. It was only like very occasionally because I can't handle that being that relaxed, you know. Uh, Ketamine sometimes, some hallucinogenics like LSD or MDMA. But really, the main thing was cocaine. That was a daily use thing. And even now, like I struggle with my nose sometimes, getting blocked up and harder to breathe through it
Mm.
because of the damage it's done. And but there was sort of a hard line I drew where it was opium, methamphetamines, and uh, heroin, where I said even that is a step too far. And I see it now actually with this lovely lady who comes to church, and excuse me, she comes and you see the damage it's done to her body, right?
Mm.
She's very very thin, and she's very shaky on her feet, and that was a step too far for me. And I do take pride in the fact that I've been helping people who have struggled with these sorts of things, because it it would be for me it would be over 3 grams a day, and for her she was taking at least an injection of heroin a day.
Mm.
And you can tell the way people would uh, interact when they're like that, and that it's something that's a great tragedy of today that we have people lost like this.
Yeah. Jack, can you share a little bit about um, the things that were, you mentioned your stepfather passed away. What were some of the other things that were going on that led you at 14 to, your friends? Was there, I mean, you mentioned about doing it with your friends. So there was, maybe was there some peer pressure there, or just was it the thing to do in your peer group at that age? What were the things that led you down that particular path? There may have been other things. You didn't sound like you jumped into sports more. You jumped into swimming, or some other, the theater or something more, but instead you found a place with drug usage. What was that like for you? How did you find yourself going down that path?
So yeah, as you said, is my stepfather. He was a role model for me, and he was how I do my best to behave now. He taught me how I carry myself now, and losing him was devastating. It was 3 days after my birthday, he
Mm.
passed away, and I watched him pass in the hospital. Um, and then after that, we went into quite severe poverty, because my mother, she's been sick for a very, very long time, and she can't work. And I would often leave the house because the arguments between my siblings and myself, the sadness between my mother and myself, and I found a lot of the time when I'm playing games with my mates, or when we're getting into a fight, not like a harsh fight, but as friends we're having a tussle, and it was more like I'd found uh, a separate thing to occupy myself by being with my friends. And I suppose not necessarily peer pressure, but my own desire to not lose that sort of step away from the home situation,
Uh-huh.
was I started to engage in what they engaged in. I can't say that there was necessarily no peer pressure, but it wasn't the main driving factor. It was more that if I didn't do this, it would turn out that I wouldn't have these friends. But in reality, it was after I started doing it, I lost those friends and I had to find a new group. And that group were by no means a responsible place to be around when I was 15 or 16.
Hmm.
And they were the ones who got me into running it to sell. And it was during that time that I started to get into vicious fights, like people trying to take what I had with a knife, trying to get out of pain, like all of these sorts of things. And I suppose the peer pressure more came from that second group that I hang around to make me a runner, and then my being hooked on it at that point. Because as I said, I was using quite a large amount, especially for that age.
Hmm.
Um, and the peer pressure that, you're not going to get any more of this if you aren't running it, you know what I mean? Where it's more like, well, I don't know necessarily how to put it into words, but a bit like how, in Hollywood they say the golden handcuffs. If you don't do this, you don't get paid. I was with the white handcuffs. If you don't do this, you don't get coke.
Ah, okay. And so, and at that point, you needed it or wanted it, so you do what you're being told to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you? What led you to finding your way out of that? Fast forward a little bit, then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about some things. But how did you find your way coming out of it?
So I was into my mid to late 18 years, and I don't know why, but for some reason that day I picked up a Bible and I just flipped open the pages just to a random place, and it was in Isaiah, I think somewhere around 53, and I just started to read, and I read up to Isaiah 56, right? And it was in Isaiah 56. Well, I should preface, I was raised a Catholic, right?
Hmm.
And so I knew the story of the Bible roughly, or at least of the New Testament roughly. And I started reading Isaiah 56, and it's the reason now that I say Isaiah is my favorite book in the Bible, for many, many reasons, but this one mainly. I I read it, and it would say things like, uh, the man who came was judged unfairly in trial. He was lashed, he was beaten, he was rebuked by the people. Um, and that is important later, but it's the last or second to last verse where it says, "He who was blameless poured out his soul to make intercession with the Lord for the transgressors," right?
Hmm.
And if you're familiar with the story of Jesus, you would know Jesus was tried unfairly in the court for claiming to be God. He was then lashed and rebuked and beaten by the people. And we understand that his final sacrifice at the cross was to take on our sin so that we would be made pure in the eyes of God. And it was reading that and making that connection. I felt like a fire in my bones, like down to the bones in my fingers and my hands, felt it in my skull, my ribs, my legs, my toes. And I just started to cry. And it was in that moment that I just felt such a loving embrace. And as if everything that I had done didn't matter anymore. And it was when I truly returned to Jesus. Um, and just for context, the book of Isaiah was written 700 years before the birth of Christ. So just from looking back, it's even more incredible that that was written that early. But it it was something that formed a new a new direction for me, where I wanted to improve myself and improve my life, improve for the people that were around me, take better care of my family, reconnect with them, and do my best to look after my mum and my brother. And now I'm disabled, so I can't work. So I put that effort into the church, where I run these addiction meetings now because, you know, it was when I was about 21. I had been, I'd had a total of 4 relapses. And it was by the time I was 21, I'd realised that those relapses were in the space of about 9 months from that initial moment. But I was still letting it hang over my head. Like it was always a constant pressure, right? And I started to realise, well, that's because I'm by myself in it. I've not told my family because, I couldn't bear for them to sit there and listen to me tell all the horrible things I'd done. But I was doing it by myself. So I started to speak to my friends. I spoke to my brother. I spoke to the church father. And it was from then on that I thought, well, all of these other people are alone. There's all of these people that out in the city. I walk past them every day. These people are alone. They don't have somebody. They're in their misery with their company. So that's what drove me towards starting the addiction meetings. And I was shocked. The first week I had 2 people come in, but it was the second week I was shocked. Those 2 people brought another 3 and another 2 each, and then the week after that there was suddenly a dozen people. A week after that, there's a dozen and a half, and it's like all of these people, all of them, they were like me. They had no one to reach out to. They had this stake in their chest, this nagging pain that they were covering up with being inebriated or high. All these things, they were just exactly like me. They were just by themselves. So that's when I was like, okay, I have to do this every single time. I have to keep going with this because, like, we, in my story, as I thankfully I was young enough to make those mistakes and correct myself before I was an adult. But these are people who they have families and they have responsibilities, and they're all struggling. But if I mean, could you imagine you going to your wife and saying, I have a problem with smoking meth? It's like, it's devastating to tell someone you love that. But it's one of the most important things where you do have someone to talk to about it. And there's even times where it is the husband and the wife who are going through this. And then you have to step in even more because now you have 2 people so bonded. It, it's really tragedy. But that's why I think that with your podcast, with what you do, it is very important to get this message out that you aren't alone, that you don't have to suffer through this. Because no matter how big my cross was to bear, there's people who have it far worse, and there there must be some place that welcomes them with open arms.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That and thank you for that. And you're right. I think that people do need exactly what you're saying, a place to know that it's safe to talk. It's safe to be open and to not hold that burden alone, right? Very important to do that. And thank you for saying it. Thank you for sharing your portion of the story. I'm curious, Jack, if there were things that you think you might have telegraphed to your family that they could have seen if they had been paying attention? What are signs that families should look for and see, especially with someone so young at 14 starting that, and by the time you got into it, selling it? Are there signs? Are there things that people could have noticed or should have noticed or they might look for it? Maybe there's subtle signs that they're not obvious, but what are things that families could look for, if you will?
Um, so I can't speak much for things like downers, but for stimulants, it would be staying up for days on end without sleep, big dark circles under eyes, um, erratic movement, erratic behavior, always sniffing, because there's something up in there.
Mm,
Uh, Big coughs because they'll start struggling to breathe. High heart rate, sweating. These are like normal signs, in an active young boy. But when it's all together, that's something you should really take notice of. When it comes to if it's selling, the biggest thing is like war wounds, busted up knuckles, black eyes, busted lips, knife wounds, or any of these signs. I passed it off as me being a klutz because I still am, but it it it's very easy for a parent of young boys where it's normal for them to get into a fight every now and again. Uh, I mean, me and my brother, we used to fight all the time. But if it was like me, where I've had to have three teeth replaced in the back of my mouth, that's something that you really should take notice of. And to be fair, the only reason it didn't is because I paid for it myself to get done. It's like I just had a droopy tongue for a day. But there's a whole congregation of things, and if there's a combination of these things, staying up for 3 days, they're always sniffing. There's there's something up in their nose, and they're always sweating, or they're pale skin. Like that's something that you really need to take notice of. Um, but I should caution as well that some of these things, perhaps not staying up for so many days, but some of these things that you can see as just a young active boy, right? But it's not when it's just in isolation where you can't have one without the others when someone's like that.
mhm. So it sounds like you also went through some really intricate ways of hiding from your family what you were doing.
Yeah. So as I said, we were in quite deep poverty. So uh, some of the money that I was making, I would just say I was doing gardening around the neighborhood and then give it to my mum in cash. Um, so there was times where I was doing gardening around the neighborhood and I was getting cash, but that would not nearly explain the amount of cash that I had.
Mhm.
Um, there was a
So
lot of
parents,
time.
maybe parents checking into. I mean, I could imagine if you're living in poverty and your child is able to go out and do some things and be very industrious and bring some money home, you don't want to second guess it and make the child feel like, or the young person feel like you don't trust them or believe them. But parents really may need to, sounds like what you're saying. Parents need to look a little more deeply into that, even especially if you're in a situation where there's poverty and suddenly you're bringing home more amounts of cash than would make sense to do. Like you weren't doing
Yeah,
that many yards. You weren't doing that many yards a day. Um,
Yeah,
if you were to do
a
the math
child that
and look
age
at the
should not
behavior.
have that deep pockets, right?
Right.
Um, but the other thing is as well, uh, I'm not going to say being out of the house is bad, but there was times where I wouldn't be home for like a week. I'd be sleeping around my friend's house. That's not normal.
Mm,
You know, a 2 day stay around a friend's, you know, fair enough. But being gone for a week unplanned, because, well, that's the key, being unplanned. If I just send a text message saying, oh, I'm staying around Aaron's or Tom or Harry, I'm going to stay around his house for a week just through a text message. You don't know his parents. You don't know his phone number. You don't know his parents' phone number. You don't know the address. That's not normal. And in fairness, my mother was like, you know, you need to give me his phone numbers and addresses and stuff. It's just I was an rebellious, obnoxious child. But it it's not normal for these things to happen, and it's very easy when you're in poverty to dismiss it as, you know, we're poor. He doesn't want to be at the house. We're too poor for heating. He wants to stay at his friend's house that's got heating. You know, those sorts of excuses, right? But
mm,
it is very important, especially for someone that age, that you are paying attention, especially if you're in a single parent household. And I
mm,
do understand it's very difficult because now, or well, before I was disabled, I was actually making money honestly to look after my family.
mhm,
But it's and it is difficult to manage both. But when you are a single parent to manage the household, it's more important than when you have two parents that you are paying attention. Because when there are two parents, you know, you can sort of shift some of that responsibility onto your husband or your wife, and they can take over 70% of the kids' role. But when you're by yourself and you're only taking on 30% yourself, then you have another 70% that's going to fill in and influence the children in ways that you don't understand and you're not even aware of.
mhm. I see, yeah. And so it's interesting that you say that when you did finally reveal things to your family, was there a sense that they kind of that they ever knew some of it or thought some of it or suspected it, like maybe your mom and felt that because you were helping out, she looked the other way? Did you get a sense of that, or was there more of a sense of shock and concern from them?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I hadn't spoken to my mother about it. I've only spoken to my brother.
Ah,
Uh,
okay.
and the pure reason behind that is it's still a fear thing, you know,
Mhm,
not knowing how they react. And it was terrifying even to just talk about it to my brother. And I spoke about it to my brother because I thought he'd already sussed it out, you know.
mhm,
He'd figured it out. And I spoke to him and he turned to me and all he said was, I wish you'd said it sooner. And that struck me
mm,
because, you know, as I was saying with these people who are alone in their misery, it's often it's often within arm's reach. As you know, my first thing to embrace was God, and you know He is always there with you as well. But I don't know particularly why the first thing that I didn't reach for would be my brother, because me and my brother we are very very close.
mhm.
But for some reason, I felt a distance between us. But that's the thing; it's imaginary.
How did your brother
It's
take your stepfather's death?
um he probably took it the best of us. He refocused into studies. You know, he's very mathematically minded. He's an accountant now. Um, but he didn't necessarily grieve normally because he is a bit neurodivergent, as I am with my schizophrenia.
Mhm,
He he's autistic, and he didn't really express anything to me. It was more that he he not necessarily isolate himself, but he was just quieter and he was just working more, right? Because he's a little bit older. He had just finished high school. Um, well, a few years later, that is, he'd just finished high school, and I just realised at the times when I was home that he would sit on the settee, he would be on his laptop, or he'd switch on the telly, and there would just be some moments where you see him and he sort of slumps. And I think that would be another thing, just even when it comes to grief, not necessarily related to drugs, but that it's not something that goes away in a day, but it's something that hangs over you. And I think for my brother, it was far more impactful than anyone realized just because he was quiet. And it's the same issue with me being quiet about the sorts of things I was doing outside of the house. People are quiet about what's going on inside of their heart. And it's another thing of perhaps not them reaching out for what's next to them, but you reaching out to someone who has closed themselves off.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not that big of a difference, but it's a difference that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. And and so thank you again for sharing that. And I think there's a lot to go on with the dynamics of family and relationships, grief. So you had a lot going on. I hope that you had given yourself some space to forgive and to heal, understanding that at 14 you were going through a lot, and going from a two-parent household that seemed maybe a little more stable to losing a trusted father figure and role model, to poverty with mom trying to take care and hold it all together, with you not, and you and your brother not getting along at the time. There's a lot going on, and I think a lot of our viewers and listeners and people that may come across this podcast at some point might relate to all or parts of that scenario and that in your story. And so I do again appreciate you sharing. I know as hard as it has been to talk about it to your family, it must be equally as hard to talk about it to me and to a group of folks, and not know where your story's going, right? So for that, I'm really grateful for you sharing a bit of that story. I'm intrigued by your finding um, God in the midst of all of this in a new and unique way, and I think that that's a beautiful thing. I'm curious if you have any um, if you could say something that would draw more people to move into recovery and to understand the that you may reoccur, that it may happen again, and you have to pick yourself back up and start back where you leave off in recovery, right? What could you say to them that might draw more folks in or help them to hold on if they're teetering on that edge of recovery and recurrence?
Well, the main thing is there is no man or woman or child who is perfect except for Jesus. And if you want to hold yourself to his standard, all you'll do is fail. If you want to try and work to meet that standard, well, that's very different. Because what you have to understand is when you're trying to work to meet a standard, even if you're not religious or if you're uh, agnostic about it, then if you want to say, I want to recover, then a setback is inevitable. I mean, even when you're walking to the shops, right? You might trip and stumble a little bit when you're crossing the road.
Mhm.
It's normal. But the thing is, failure is the foundation for success. And if you just give up because you fail once, then you're not really doing your best, are you? Because when you are doing your best, it it doesn't mean you're perfect and you're not going to fail. It means that even when you fail, you pick yourself back up. And the main thing is, for me, for anyone who is listening, heaven rejoices for those who return to the flock, and even more so for those who have had an arduous journey. So when you struggle and you go through strife, that's the moments where you do have to pick yourself back up. You don't have to pick yourself back up when you're living a lavish life and everything's easy.
Hmm.
The true test is, are you going to carry on? Are you going to keep trying? And I hope sincerely that you all do, because on the other side is a brighter, greener pasture than you can ever imagine.
And with that, I think we'll leave it there, Jack. And thank you for sharing of your story. I'd love the opportunity to come back and talk with you in a few months to see how your journey continues and how your ministry is building and growing. And maybe you can share some tips about the things that you're doing in your ministry that are helping people, that may help some of our other faith communities that are partnering with us or doing work with us, maybe have some new ideas and new ways to engage community. I'm really pleased and excited to know that once you started, you had such growth in those early days. And that's a testament to, I think, the passion that you bring to this and to who you are, and the honesty and transparency that you are living in front of those people's lives. And I think that people are gravitating to that. And so I commend you for doing such great work and for finding ways for your own healing as you continue on that journey. So if you don't mind, love to check in with you in a few months. I'll have our staff reach out to you to get on the calendar for you in a few months, in the spring of next year, maybe, just to see where you are on this journey and how the journey continues. I think it's important for people to hear the journey continue and to know that it's not a one and done, but that there is a process, there's time, and there is great growth along the way on the journey.
It's an honor to be here. I'd love to come back. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. You all, thank you so much for joining us again today on Energy Incorporated's Thrive Live, where we talk with real people with real stories about real solutions. And today has been an example of that with Jack. Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing your being a very real person, sharing a very real story, with some very real solutions, and they're working. And so thank you for sharing that. We hope that you will join us again, that you'll like our Facebook and our YouTube channels. Like us, join us, follow us. Please share podcasts with your friends, your family, your community, so we can continue to build a network of people that are engaged in this work. We invite you to join with our partners on our app on Marigold. And if you can look on the PlayStation Play Store or the Apple store and look for Marigold and download the app for folks that are living with and living through the journey of substance use and healing and recovery. It's a great way to connect 24/7 with a community-based organization, and we'll put a QR code up for you at the end of the video as well, so you can check in and you can sign up and be connected to a community 24/7 through one of our community partners. We look forward to all that you all are doing, all that you can share with us. If you're interested in being a part of the podcast, join us. You can reach us at energyincorporated@gmail.com. That's INNERGY incorporated at gmail.com. We would love to talk with you, love to hear your story, whether it's your story, a story that you lived through with someone that you love and care about, or friends. If you've dealt with peer pressure, you've dealt with how to get help through your ministry, or just in community, or living through struggles in life, whether it's around substance use or mental health, or just positive living in general, or anything that you want to share, we'd love to have you come in and talk about your story and your journey and your solution. So thank you so much again, Jack, for being here. I'm
God
Darryl,
bless you.
Reverend Darryl Moch with Energy Incorporated's Thrive Live, and we will see you real soon again with real people, real stories, and real solutions.